Good evening. Welcome to Talk Gnosis. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Kabbalah and the Gospel of Thomas, and we are being joined by Bishop Keizer. Good evening, Bishop Keizer. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Thank you for joining us tonight. The Gospel of Thomas is something that we cover a lot here on Talk Gnosis. We tend to go through a verse or two and then kind of give a topic on it. It's been a continual series now for a long time. So this is, I think, a subject that's going to be near and dear to both myself and Bishop Peterson. Can you give us a little insight on the Gospel of Thomas and sort of its inner circle initiatic teachings of Yeshua?
Well, in the first place, the Gospel of Thomas has not been properly understood and translated because when Egyptologists translate it, they just try to do it literally and they don't know what the hell is being talked about, because these are actually authentic teachings of Yeshua. They come from an Aramaic speaker from probably between AD 35 and AD 50. I use the term AD so people won't get confused with all that CE stuff, but and the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas constitutes about 80% of it. So you can't translate it without referring back to the Aramaic, the Hebrew Aramaic roots of the terms he's using. These are all Kabbalistic terms. We think of Kabbalah as something that start in the 13th century or 12th century with the Zohar and so on. That's not true. It begins about 400 BC, as most Jewish scholars will tell you. And by the time of Yeshua, there's a very highly developed oral tradition that's a Kabbalistic tradition, and it includes all kinds of stuff that it's not quite like at all what they have in medieval Kabbalah.
So what do you see then as some of the issues and problems with many of the modern translations then, Bishop?
Well, they're translated correctly from the Coptic, but remember the Coptic is a version of the original Greek, which comes to Egypt probably about the 2nd century, and it's produced by Thomasians, by people in Syria who were originally an all-male group and an ascetic group, and they eventually started admitting women. And I don't think you'd be too keen about some of their doctrines and things. Are very elitist and all that kind of stuff. But what they had, which is golden, is they had something just like the gospel writers had with the lost document that scholars call Q, which may not be so much of a document as it is a whole bunch of different oral Jesus traditions that Matthew had and Luke had and Mark had and so on. But they had these sayings, and they're not sayings of the Lord Jesus or the Christ. They're just Jesus, Yeshua, and they're full of Aramaisms. They're full of idioms, Aramaic idioms. The Q document, which is what is shared by Matthew and Luke, or the Q material, whether it's a document or not, we don't know. But for example, Yeshua says, what you hear in one ear, do such and such with. Well, that's actually a Hebraic idiom, but the Gospel of Thomas is what you hear in one ear and the other. Now there's no way that could be a Greek idiom at all. It's a Hebrew Aramaic idiom, and it's full of stuff like that. So when you translate it, you have to translate Coptic, and then what Greek you have to refer to from the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus. Then you go back to the Aramaic. I call it Hebrew Aramaic because it was, an entirely different language, and that is full of Kabbalistic technical terms that we know from all kinds of other literature. For example, when Yeshua talks about the 5 trees in paradise, which we know from Philo of Alexandria, who was contemporary with Yeshua, we can figure out what he's talking about only if we go back to the Jewish sources. So the translations need to be aware of that when they make the translations, and a lot of them just aren't.
Are there any commercially available translations of the Gospel of Thomas that you would recommend?
Well, there are a lot of them. You can go online and get a lot of them.
Sure.
And there are a lot of good scholars that I like Marvin Myers. Probably the scholar who is closest to me in his concept of what goes on has made a translation, but he doesn't. That's Stephen. What's his name? Translates Gospel of Thomas. And he's a great scholar, part of the Jesus Seminar people or the West Star people. I've forgotten his last name for just a moment, but he again doesn't go back into the Aramaic and the Hebrew. He's still kind of stuck in the Greek, like so many biblical scholars are stuck in the Greek of the New Testament. They can't go back to the actual sayings of Jesus because they're just going to the sayings as they've been spun in Greek by Gentile Christians.
Okay. Would that be Stephen Davies?
Yes, right.
Okay. Good. Okay.
I like him.
Yeah,
but I haven't read a lot of his stuff.
Yeah, I've heard some really good things about him and his translation. But I think you bring up a very important point about the fact that you can do a good literal translation of the Coptic, but without any knowledge of of Jesus's context and what he was actually referring to, that's going to make the translations not as helpful as they might be.
Well, they won't convey what he was saying, really. If you get a translation that says, well, the images do that and the images do that, we don't, what is he talking about? What are these images? Well, he's talking about Genesis Kabbalistic interpretations of the emanation or construction of Adam, humanity. And there's so much stuff that I can't even begin to go into it. And I only like my own translation because I didn't start with anybody else's and I didn't want to refer to them. I wanted to go from scratch and then refer back to these points. And that's what I did with mine.
Okay.
Now, where do you find this particular source material? I mean, for our listeners who say, okay, I've been studying the Gospel of Thomas and I've read this particular translation, I've read this particular one, and each one of these, I see a little bit different meaning, but they all kind of speak to me. Where does one even begin to try to investigate, trying to find some of this source material of the Aramaic and to see where some of these more secret meanings that could have been transmitted to his disciples? I mean, where does one even begin to search for this?
Well, there isn't a place where it's collected. You have to be a scholar and you have to be totally familiar with the intertestamental literature, with the Babylonian Talmud, with a whole lot of stuff that's contemporary with Yeshua, with Philo of Alexandria and all these other things. So that's something that you can't do unless you've studied for years and years. You've studied the period and the context. And most people, take a literal translation of the Gospel of Thomas, and then they make their own stuff up about it, what it means. The Gospel of Thomas is more Yeshua. It's more real Kabbalistic teachings of Yeshua than it is Gnosticism in any form, whether it's not Sethian Gnosticism, it's not Valentinian Gnosticism. If it's anything, it would be closer to Mandaism, Jewish Gnosticism. It comes out of the whole Jewish Gnostic tradition, which is now being recognized by scholars. Everyone from Gershom Scholem and Giles Quisbel and all these people recognize how much there is owing to, in Gnosticism, to the Jewish Gnostic tradition, which is the tradition out of which Yeshua spoke. We call it Kabbalah. The words, the terms in Gnosticism are taken over from Hebrew Kabbalistic terms, and that's something that's quite evident to anybody that studies them both.
So when we talk about the idea that Jesus had a special teachings strictly for his inner circle of disciples, would these teachings then, and that you find in the Gospel of Thomas, that would be part of those inner teachings, possibly?
Well, they're even, many of them are in the New Testament writings, but the people that had them didn't know what they meant. And they spun them to represent, an eschatological view of the coming judgment day, and Jesus as the Christ would judge humanity, and Jesus was the Savior that if you believe in him, just belief will do the job for you, save you from hell. There was no hell. He didn't talk about hell. He talked about Gehenna, which is a purification after death before you enter the third heaven, the pardes of the third heaven, and so on. Anyway, there's a whole lot of stuff. It's just not stuff that's known anywhere in Christianity, and most Christian scholars that are biblical scholars have never familiarized themselves enough with the Jewish basis and context to even be able to relate to it. So so it's a very new thing. It's a very cutting edge thing that people are coming up with now, and I'm kind of on the edge of that, and other people are too. But as far as the inner circle goes, Yeshua gave initiatic names to his closest people. Shimon he called Kephas, which means solid like a rock. And that becomes in Greek Petros, which then is translated Peter. But that was his initiatic name. His real name was Shimon. The John and James were called Boanerges, which means powerful voices like thunder. Now, you might be interested in the fact that John, James, and Peter were the ones that he took up on the mountaintop to have the so-called, what the Christians call the transfiguration, to see his glory. That's not what that was about. That was a Merkaba experience. That was an ascent to the third heaven, to see the beings that the Jewish saints that Yeshua communicated with. And Paul's Merkaba experience that he talks about in 2 Corinthians, or the Merkaba experience of Mary Magdalene. Now, Mary's name, Magdala, which means strength, tower of strength, is not from any town. It's not Mary from Magdala. There was no town. Scholars looked for years to try to find a town of Magdala that she could have come from. And finally, they just discovered, through archaeology, a tiny little fishing village that probably had a population of 25 that was called Magdala because it had a tower. But that was not where she was from. She was a high initiate. And so that was her initiatic name. And so the Gospel of Mary preserves the Marian or the Magdalenic tradition, which was suppressed. And she was more initiated than the others. She was taken through higher degrees of Merkaba experience than the others. Anyway, I don't want to pontificate on this stuff.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. But I know that some people even will call Mary Magdalene the apostle to the apostles.
Well, that was what she was called very early.
Yeah,
that was the way she was described. Yeah,
and of course she was the one who announced the resurrection to the other disciples as well, and some of them didn't believe her. But
no, that's not true. That's a legend, very late legend that only occurs about 80, 85. The earliest information we have, and it's not found in the Q material or in the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas, is Paul's statement that Peter saw the risen Yeshua first, and then blah, 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 and then upwards of 500 people. And the word he uses for see, to see, is from horao, which means to have a vision of. Doesn't mean to see like blepsomai, means to see a physical object. But by the end of the first century, the resurrection had turned into Jesus as in a physical body who walked through walls and did funny things, and Thomas could stick his finger in his guts and all that kind of stuff. But the Gnostics from the very beginning knew that the resurrection was spiritual. And that's what Paul said in his Corinthian letters when he talked about the difference between the psychikos body and the pneumatikos body and how they're different, and one's like growth from seed and so on. So the original resurrection was about 40 days of visionary experiences that people had that ceased after 40 days. Now, the Jewish concept of the bodies, of the 6 bodies, was that after death, the nephesh, which was the personality, that was your sex, your gender, etc. If you were in your nephesh, you would be a male and you would be called Yeshua and you would have his mind and all that sort of thing. But that dissolves, and then the neshama is through purification through Gehenna, through the purificatory process for anyone who wasn't a total perfect saint. They go through that, etc. Well, the 40 days of Yeshua's visions corresponds to the 40 days that it's possible for a person to be in the neshama. It's the same. You can't understand what went on with Yeshua without understanding comparative religion. You have to look at Tibetan traditions of what happens to great teachers after they die and the visions that are seen afterwards by their disciples. It's a whole different thing. So the business of Mary being the first person to witness a resurrection is very late. The ending of Mark's gospel, which the Mark's gospel ended when it was written with the ladies, and they were ladies because the guys couldn't go up there; they would be caught. And Yeshua had told them, "Don't get caught. If you do, the whole game is over." So the ladies were able to go. And what they found was an empty tomb and a malach, a messenger, an angel, a young man, that's the way they're described, saying he will go before you into Galilee. And that's where Peter is supposed to have first had the vision. And that's where it ended. And they were afraid. And that was the end of the gospel. The rest of it was written about 150 years, 200 years later. So we have known all the manuscripts and all the things, all the evidence, the papyri and everything else don't include that last part until then. So the real Gospel of Mark did not attribute resurrection appearances to anyone, and the resurrection appearances in the synoptic Gospels that draw from Mark, but are composed about 80, 85, 90, Luke and Matthew, they have by that time there's all kinds of legends about it. The crucifixion is based on Kabbalistic interpretation of 22nd Psalm and other kinds of things that, as they appeared in Greek in the Pentateuch, which had some wrong translations of Hebrew. It doesn't say, the Psalm does not say, they pierced my hands and my feet. It says lions are nipping at my hands and my feet. And, but it all got, and of course, in crucifixion, you weren't even nailed through the palms. Yeah. You were nailed through the wrists.
Right. You can.
There's a whole lot of stuff like that. Yeah.
Sure.
So anyway, the one thing, and someone like Bishop Spong, someone like Davies, Stephen Davies, people like that give you the straight story about this stuff. I have things up on my website that tell you what the history of how the resurrection legends and the Jesus traditions developed over 100 years. And, people can see that if they want, and they can see things of introducing the Gospel of Thomas and the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas. I have that up on my YouTube sites.
Good. We're going to have to wrap this up. We can take this discussion, which I think is really interesting about the resurrection, onto the After Dark. Can you tell people where they can find you online and find all this material? Yeah.
If you go to I have two websites. One is called hometemple.org. That's just HOMETEMPLE.org. And you go to the YouTube page, there's a link to all of the pre-Christian Yeshua YouTube presentations I put up, plus the resurrection one. And I'm not sure where the Gospel of Thomas ones are up there, but the Gospel of Thomas ones are on my Lewis Keizer channel on YouTube. And then the other site is called wisdomseminars.org. I've had these up for 12, 15 years.
Okay.
And I have a lot of courses and things on there that people can
Excellent.
see.
Very good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the discussion in the After Dark podcast.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. We absolutely do appreciate your checking us out. We have some upcoming shows, including one with Reverend Dr. Christopher King, who will be discussing origins. So stay tuned here and on our Facebook page for more announcements about this. Also, we do like hearing from our viewers and listeners. Please do share your comments and ideas on this video's comments page, as well as at our on our Facebook page. So we want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
This has been a production of the Gnostic Wisdom Network. For more information about this and all of GWN's programming, please visit gnosticwisdom.net. The opinions expressed in this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of GWN, the Apostolic Johannite Church, or any other organization. This has been released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International License and is brought to you by the generous support of our patrons. To support our programs and become a patron, please visit patreon.com/Gnostic. That's patreon.com/GNOSTIC.